In this lecture, we are going to define the term risk-based approach. So the EU AI Act takes a risk-based approach to regulating artificial intelligence. I want to make sure we understand what a risk-based approach is, and that we also understand how the EU AI Act defines risk, and it's located in at least two places in the statute itself. There's also a term that you're going to see throughout this series on the EU AI Act, and that is Market Surveillance Authority. And so it's important we understand what that means. And we will conclude by looking at the 4 different risk levels that the EU AI Act addresses. So what is a risk-based approach? A risk-based approach seeks to identify, assess, and mitigate risk. It prioritizes risk based on impact and risk appetite. Once a risk is identified, the organization implements controls to mitigate that risk. Controls are tailored to the organization's strategy and risk profile. Once the system is deployed, there is continuous monitoring. And so this is not a one and done activity. It is something that continues throughout the life cycle of the AI system. And the EU AI Act shares this approach with the GDPR, which also takes a risk-based approach. The EU AI Act defines risk as well as a number of other important terms in Article 3. Specifically, risk is Article 3.2 and is defined as follows: the severity of harm combined with probability of occurrence. And that should sound familiar. We saw this definition earlier in the course. And just as a little bit of trivia for you, this comes from ISO 14971. I don't think you need to know the ISO here for the exam. That's just here so when you're out with your friends and colleagues, you can make a proper citation and sound like a real smarty pants. The other area where you will see risk defined in the EU AI Act is Article 79. And specifically, when we're looking at product safety and liability, this context is important. So risk here is seen in the context of a product presenting a risk. That is a particular term. And this term actually comes from another EU statute, which is the EU Market Surveillance Regulation. And you will see risk contextualized as follows: the potential to affect adversely health and safety of persons in general, health and safety in the workplace, protection of consumers, the environment, public security, and other public interests, to a degree which goes beyond that is considered reasonable and acceptable in relation to its intended purpose. I don't think you need to know this paragraph for the exam. In fact, I don't think you need to know about the EU Market Surveillance Regulation. But if your organization falls within the jurisdiction of the EU AI Act, it's important that you understand not just how risk is defined, but specifically its context within a safety and liability perspective. Concerning the term Market Surveillance Authority, this is a national body responsible for monitoring and enforcing product compliance and safety regulations. There are different registers of enforcement when it comes to the EU AI Act. Thankfully, you're not going to be tested on this, and so we don't get into it in this series. But there's the EU level, and then there's the member state or national body level. A market surveillance authority is specifically a national body responsible for monitoring and enforcing product compliance. We're going to close out this lecture looking at the 4 different risk levels. The majority of the EU AI Act focuses on high-risk systems, and we'll see that in just a moment. There are different requirements for each of the 4 levels. And the EU AI Act provides clear guidance and requirements for each of these. The 4 levels that you need to know for the exam are unacceptable/prohibited, high, limited, and minimal. Now, I know someone out there is going to come up to me and say, well, Dr. David, the articles themselves don't actually say anything about limited and minimal risk levels. And I'm going to say, okay, but if you read into the fine print, you will see the terms limited risk and either low risk or minimal risk. So they are in there. More importantly, in fact, most importantly, This is what the IAPP wants you to know, all right? You're taking this course to prepare for the exam. IAPP wants you to know this, and so it's in the course. At a very high level, and we are going to talk more about these in detail throughout this series, at a high level, unacceptable and prohibited systems are banned. High-risk systems are those with a potential to harm, that pose potential harm to safety or fundamental rights. For high-risk systems, there are mandatory requirements, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those requirements. Limited risk systems pose, well, limited risks. For these systems, there are some transparency requirements. And finally, minimal risk systems will have low to no risk. And for these systems or for their organizations, there are voluntary requirements. In this lecture, we defined risk-based approach in the context of the EU AI Act. A risk-based approach seeks to identify, assess, and mitigate risk, and prioritize risks based on impact and the organization's risk appetite. Risk is understood as the severity of harm combined with probability of occurrence, as well as the potential to affect adversely health and safety of persons. You're going to see the term market surveillance authority a lot. Remember that this is a national body responsible for monitoring and enforcing product compliance and safety regulations. And the 4 levels of risk the IAPP wants you to remember are unacceptable prohibited risk, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk.